That night, on the edge of the African savanna, an aging ranger woke to a rough lion's growl right outside his door. When he opened it, he did not find a predator ready to leap, but a thin lioness, her golden eyes wide with panic as she backed away, step by step, as if begging him to follow. He had no way of knowing that crossing that threshold would draw him into the wild's last desperate plea, to save her trapped cub beneath a hidden poacher's bunker. The night had settled over the savanna like a heavy, dark blanket when Daniel woke to a sound that didn't belong. For years he had slept through the distant cries of hyenas, the hoot of owls, even the low rumble of lions far off in the grass. But this was different. The sound came from just outside the thin wooden door of his small ranger's station, short, hushed bursts of a lion's growl, so close the frame of the house seemed to breathe with it. For a long moment he lay still, listening. The generator hummed in the corner. A cup rattled softly on the table as the growls came again, low but insistent. His heart climbed into his throat. No lion should be this close, not unless something was very wrong. He swung his legs out of bed, feeling the familiar ache in his knees, and reached for the flashlight hanging on the wall. The beam cut a pale stripe across the room, catching dust and the edges of a battered map. Daniel's fingers brushed the rifle leaning by the door, then stopped. A part of him wanted the weight of it in his hands. Another part, quieter but stubborn, told him to wait. The growls weren't the sound of an animal on the attack. They sounded almost restrained. He unlatched the door and eased it open. There, only a few yards away, stood a lioness. Her coat, once golden, was dulled by dust and the reddish soil of the dry season. Her ribs showed faintly under her hide. Scars ringed one front leg in a cruel circle, the kind that didn't come from a fight with another animal. Her eyes, though, were what held him in place, bright, burning amber, fixed on him with a focus that felt almost human. The lioness, Amara, did not charge. She did not roar. She let out a small, rough growl, then took 2 slow steps backward, never breaking eye contact. She turned her head, looking out into the darkness beyond the edge of his porch, then back at him as if checking whether he understood. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears. Every instinct told him to shut the door, to call in a report, and stay inside. Yet something in that steady, urgent gaze pinned him where he stood, whispering that this was not a random visit of a wild predator. It felt, impossibly, like a summons. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The night hummed softly around them, the insects, the faint sigh of the dry wind against the tin roof of the ranger's station. Daniel stood in the doorway with the flashlight hanging loose at his side, and the lioness stood in the half-light, chest rising and falling, eyes never leaving his face. Then Amara gave a rough, muffled growl and backed away again, 3 measured steps this time. She turned, looking out into the sea of darkness beyond the clearing, then swung her head back toward him. The message, if it could be called that, was strangely clear. Come. Daniel swallowed. He could feel every old story he'd ever heard about lions pressing in on him. Men dragged from camps, cattle taken in the night, the sudden leap from the grass. His hand went again to the rifle by the doorframe. It would be so easy to grab it, to put something solid and familiar between himself and that wild, unknowable gaze. But something in the way she held herself stopped him. There was tension in her muscles, yes, but it was not the coiled spring of an animal about to pounce. It felt more like a rope pulled tight between panic and control. There was fear in her, too, he realized. Fear and urgency. While he hesitated, somewhere beneath their feet another memory stirred. Amara, earlier that day, pacing the lip of a shattered concrete pit. Dust had risen in choking clouds when the ground gave way, swallowing the small, spotted body of her cub. Kito's thin cries had drifted up from the darkness, growing weaker as she clawed and clawed at the hard edges that refused to yield. Her claws worked until they bled. The stone did not move. Above the scent of dust and fear had come another smell, metallic and bitter, one she had learned to hate, the trace of humans. Now, as the human stood in the doorway, that same smell clung faintly to him. Metal, oil, the harsh tang of fire. Danger, yes, but also the power to break what she could not. Daniel drew a slow breath. He stepped back into the station, set the rifle carefully against the wall, and reached instead for his flashlight, his small knife, and the crackling radio on the table. He shrugged into his worn jacket, closed the door behind him, and turned once more to face the lioness. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Let's see what this is." Amara had already begun to move, slipping toward the edge of the clearing. She paused, just long enough to glance back at him. Daniel tightened his grip on the light and followed her into the waiting dark. The gully deepened as they went, its sides rising on either hand in broken shelves of dirt and rock. The ground here was different, Daniel noticed. It was not the soft, natural curve of earth shaped by rain, but a raw, scraped place, as if something heavy had chewed into the land and left it wounded. Bits of concrete stuck out from the soil, pale and sharp in his flashlight beam. Amara moved more quickly now. Her tail flicked, her ears tilting forward and back in restless jerks. She leapt up onto a low rise of broken stone and stood there, rigid, staring at a mound of debris ahead. Daniel climbed after her, his boots slipping on loose gravel. When he reached her side, his breath caught. In front of them lay what had once been a structure, a low, squat building of concrete now collapsed in on itself. Slabs of roofing lay at odd angles, some half buried, others leaning together to make a jagged little canyon. Rusted rebar jutted out like twisted ribs. The smell was stronger here, dust, dampness, and under it all, a sour, lingering odor he recognized from old crime scenes. Animals kept where they were, never meant to live. Amara stepped closer, nose working, then lowered her head and pressed one ear to a crack between two pieces of broken slab. Her whole body went still. A heartbeat later, she gave a sound Daniel had not heard from her yet, a raw, aching moan that seemed to tear itself out of her chest. She pawed at the rubble, claws scraping on stone, frantic but careful, as if she knew that too much force might make everything fall. Daniel swung the light along the base of the fallen wall and saw it. The edge of a metal door, its thick frame bent and half buried beneath the weight of concrete. Around it lay the ghosts of human work, lengths of chain, a snapped padlock, a length of steel cable still looped in a cruel circle. This hadn't been a home. It had been a holding place, a secret. Then, faint but unmistakable, he heard it too. From somewhere beyond that twisted metal came a thin, broken sound. Not the full cry of a strong cub, but a hoarse, struggling whimper, rising, falling, fighting for air. Amara's head snapped up, eyes blazing. She looked at Daniel, then back at the buried door, then at him again, as if there were no more time for doubt or fear. "All right," he said softly, more to steady his own shaking hands than anything else. "I hear him." He set the flashlight down on a flat stone, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped toward the buried mouth of the underground chamber where the cub was trapped. The metal frame was colder than he expected. Daniel ran his hands along the bent edge of the door, feeling for any place that might give. Dust coated his fingers, gritty and thick. Above him, Amara paced in tight circles, her claws clicking against stone, her breath coming in short, harsh bursts. Each time the cub whimpered, she froze, ears straining, then let out a soft, broken growl that seemed to urge Daniel on. He wedged his shoulder under a slab of concrete, resting against the door, and pushed. The stone shifted only a fraction, then settled back with a dull scrape. Bits of gravel rained down. He stepped away, catching his breath, and looked around for leverage. A rusted length of rebar lay nearby. He grabbed it, jammed one end under the edge of the slab, and leaned his weight into it. This time, something moved. The concrete groaned and tipped, just enough to ease the pressure along the top of the door. Amara threw her weight against a chunk of rubble on the other side, muscles bunching under her dusty coat as she clawed and shoved. Together, man and lioness worried at the broken heap until, with a shudder, the slab slid aside and thumped onto the dirt. The metal door was still crooked in its frame, but there was now a narrow gap at one corner. Cold, stale air breathed out, carrying with it the smell of damp concrete, rust, and the faint, sour scent of animals that had been held far too long in the dark. Daniel picked up his flashlight, took a steadying breath, and squeezed himself through the opening. The beam sliced through the black, landing on rows of empty cages stacked against the walls, their bars stained and bowed. Chains hung from bolts in the ceiling. A metal table, its surface scarred and pitted, sat in the center of the room like an abandoned altar. He forced himself to look past it all, following the weak, rasping sound that had brought them here. In the far corner, half buried under a fallen beam and a spill of broken bricks, lay the small, spotted body of the cub. Kito's sides fluttered with each shallow breath. One hind leg was pinned beneath the cracked beam. His claws dug deep into the dust, where he had tried to pull himself free. His eyes blinked slowly in the sudden light, wide with fear and pain. "It's all right," Daniel whispered, though he knew the cub could not understand the words. His voice seemed to settle his own nerves as much as anything. "I've got you." He set the flashlight on the floor, braced his hands under the edge of the beam, and pushed. The weight bit into his palms, sending a sharp ache up his arms. The ceiling above creaked in warning, bits of plaster drifting down like pale snow. For a heartbeat, he considered letting go, backing out, calling for heavy equipment and a full team. But Kito let out a thin, strangled cry, and from outside the door came Amara's answering roar, fierce and desperate. Gritting his teeth, Daniel dug in his boots and gave one more heave. The beam shifted just enough. The cub jerked his leg free and scrambled, trembling, toward the open space. Daniel grabbed him gently around the middle, pulling him out from the rubble and into his arms, cradling the small, shaking body against his chest. Above, Amara's roar broke into a low, urgent rumble, the sound of a mother calling her child home. Kito was lighter than Daniel expected, all bone and trembling muscle under a dusty coat. The cub's heart thudded fast against his arm as he turned toward the crooked opening in the door. The flashlight beam jittered over the stained walls and empty cages while he moved, careful not to jostle the injured leg. Squeezing through the gap was harder on the way out. Concrete scraped his shoulders. For a moment he was wedged there, half in the dark, half in the thin strip of night outside. Then a stronger sound rolled over him, the deep, urgent rumble of Amara's call, so close it vibrated in his chest. With one last push, he slipped free and stumbled onto the rubble. Amara was on him at once, but not with teeth. She crowded forward until her nose brushed Kito's fur. Breathing him in, her tongue sweeping once, twice over the cub's head, her whole body shook with the force of her relief. Kito let out a weak mewl and nuzzled into her chest, pressing against the safe, familiar rhythm of her heartbeat. For a brief, fragile moment, everything else fell away. It was just mother and child, and the quiet, grateful tremor in the air around them. Then, from far off across the savanna, came the low growl of an engine. Daniel's head snapped up. Two beams of light were cutting through the darkness, bouncing over the rough track that led illegally toward this forgotten place. The hair along Amara's spine lifted. She turned her head, ears pricked, body positioning itself between the approaching lights and her cub without a second thought. Daniel fumbled for the radio at his belt, thumb pressing the button hard. Control, This is Daniel at the old gully site. I've located an illegal underground facility. Possible poachers inbound. I need backup now." Static hissed, then a voice answered, tight and alert. "Copy that, Daniel. We're on our way. Stay low. Do not engage." He slipped his phone from his pocket and with quick shaking hands snapped a few short videos. The bent door, the chains, the crushed concrete around the entrance. Proof, the kind that could not be argued away. The truck drew closer, engine laboring. Daniel could hear voices now, rough laughter, someone cursing about unfinished work. A door slammed. A man's silhouette moved against the glow of headlights, gesturing toward the ruined structure. "We'll drop the rest of the charges and be done with it," a voice called. "No one ever comes out here." Daniel's mouth went dry. He crouched behind a slab of broken wall, pulling himself as low as he could. A cold, tight feeling gripped his stomach as he looked back at the lioness and her cub. If that first collapse had trapped Kito, what would a second one do? There was no time to move far, no time to think. He hissed softly toward Amara, a useless human sound, and flattened himself over Kito's small body, trying to cover as much of the cub as he could with his arms. Amara understood the danger in her own way. She swung around them, muscles bunched, making herself a living shield, her body curved over both man and cub. The night split open with a second blast. The ground jumped under them. A wave of hot air and dust slammed across the gully, followed by the clatter of falling stone. Pebbles and chunks of concrete rained down, bouncing off Amara's back, striking Daniel's shoulders and arms. Kito shuddered, but stayed tucked against them, wrapped in fur and cloth, and the stubborn will of two very different hearts refusing to let go. When the echo finally faded, the old entrance to the underground room was gone, swallowed by a fresh heap of shattered concrete. If they had been a few minutes later, there would have been nothing left to save. For a while after the blast, there was only dust and ringing silence. Daniel coughed, blinking grit from his eyes. Beside him, Amara shook herself, sending a small shower of pebbles skittering down the slope. Under his arm, Kito trembled, but still breathed, his narrow chest rising and falling against Daniel's sleeve. Then other sounds crept back in, the ticking of cooling metal from the truck. Harsh voices, sharper now, no longer careless. Someone shouted about the blast going too close. Another cursed the mess. Footsteps crunched over broken stone as men moved toward the ruined entrance, unaware that anyone else was there. Before they could get far, a new sound rolled over the savanna, a distant thudding that grew louder, like slow, steady drum beats in the sky. A spotlight swung across the darkness, bright as a second moon. The chop of helicopter blades filled the air, followed by the unmistakable growl of multiple engines approaching fast from the opposite side. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Backup had arrived. Headlights sliced through the dust as ranger trucks skidded to a stop along the rim of the gully. Doors flew open. Figures in uniform spilled out, weapons drawn but held low, moving with the swift, practiced precision of people who had done this many times before. Caught between the ruined hulk of the hidden facility and the sudden ring of vehicles, the poachers froze. One of them, broad-shouldered, with a red scarf at his throat, turned toward the lights, face twisted in disbelief. Daniel recognized him from old files and grainy photos. Mbele, the man whose name had been whispered for years whenever a lion disappeared and only bones were found. "Hands up!" a commanding voice shouted from above. "Step away from the truck!" The standoff might have played out cleanly if not for the fact that at the bottom of the gully, a lioness and her cub stood shoulder to shoulder with a ranger. Amara's tail lashed once. She planted herself squarely in front of Kito and Daniel, eyes flashing in the glare of the lights, teeth just visible as her lips pulled back in a warning that needed no translation. To her, more humans had arrived, carrying the same smell as the ones who built this place. She did not know they came with different intentions. She only knew she had a cub to protect. Rifles swung, tracking her instinctively. Fingers tightened on triggers. Someone shouted, "Lion in the kill zone! Hold your fire!" Daniel's voice cracked as he scrambled to his feet, keeping one hand on Kito's back. He stepped out from behind Amara, raising his empty hand high so the others could see him. "She's not attacking. She brought me here. Without her, we wouldn't have found any of this." For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. On one side, Amara stood with her muscles bunched, every line of her body ready to spring if anyone came too close to her cub. On the other, a line of rangers, weapons, trained, faces tense in the harsh light. Between them, Daniel moved slowly, carefully, like a man crossing a rope bridge over a canyon. He took his hat off and lowered his head slightly, not to the men on the rim, but to the lioness a few feet away. Then he stepped back, putting a little space between himself and her, showing her, and everyone watching, that he would not push closer, would not challenge the boundary she had drawn. Amara watched him, sides heaving. Her ears flicked toward the shouts above, then back to him, then down to Kito pressed against her leg. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the sharp edge of her stance softened. Her lips closed over her teeth. Her tail eased from a lash to a restless swish. Around the rim of the gully, rifle barrels dipped a fraction. Orders changed from fire to arrest. Rangers moved in on the poachers instead, snapping handcuffs onto wrists, pulling weapons from stunned hands. Under the wide African sky, justice finally began to close its grip, while a lioness and her cub stood witness, alive because, for one rare night, a Wildheart had chosen to trust. In the weeks that followed, the gully changed. Where the broken door had once gaped like a wound in the earth, there was now a ring of bright tape and a small forest of metal stakes. Investigators came and went, walking carefully over the ground, taking measurements, photographs, and notes. Chains, cages, and rusted tools were carried out in neat rows and loaded into trucks, no longer hidden in the dark, but laid bare under the open sky. Daniel watched much of it from the edge, hands in his pockets, the dust settling on his boots. The videos he had taken that night had traveled farther than he ever expected. First to his superiors, then to offices in the city he would probably never see. Mbele and his men were moved away in guarded vehicles. Papers were signed, cases opened. The old stories of vanished lions finally had a name, a place, and proof. But for all the movement around him, there was one question that stayed with him when the days grew quiet again. He had seen Amara and Kito disappear into the grass once the immediate danger had passed, the cub limping but determined at her side. Since then, each patrol out into the reserve felt a little like looking for something he could not name. His eyes lingered on distant shapes, on the roll of a tawny back in the grass, on tracks softened by wind. None of them were hers. One evening the sun slid low and wide across the savanna, turning the world the color of old copper. Daniel stood outside his station, sipping lukewarm tea and listening to the gentle thrum of insects waking for the night. The air had that brief golden stillness that comes just before darkness takes hold. That was when he heard it, a low, familiar rumble, carried on the breeze from the rise beyond the clearing. Not the sharp bark of a startled lion, nor the deep challenge of a territorial male. It was softer, almost like a spoken word drawn out on a single breath. He set the cup down and stepped forward. On the ridge, outlined against the fading light, stood Amara. Beside her, shoulder brushing her flank, was Kito. He was taller now, still young, but no longer so fragile, his step hesitant only when he put weight on the once-pinned leg. They did not come closer than the edge of the clearing. Amara stood still, watching him. The distance between them held all the memory of that night, the fear, the dust, the blast, the moment when a lioness had chosen to trust a man. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Slowly, without thinking much about it, he lifted his hand in a small open gesture. Not a wave, more a quiet acknowledgement from one guardian of this place to another. Amara's great head dipped just once, in a slow, deliberate motion. Her eyes blinked long and calm, then she turned. With Kito at her side, she slipped back into the sea of grass, the tall stems folding around them until there was nothing left but the rustle of leaves and the deepening song of the coming night. Long after they were gone, Daniel remained at the edge of the clearing, listening. Somewhere out in the dark, lions would roar and answer each other as they always had. But to him, that sound would never again be just a warning of a predator on the move. It would also be a reminder that for one fragile night, the wild had knocked on his door and asked for his help, and that he had been given the rare honor of answering. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.